Okay, hopefully that's recording. Thank you guys for coming. I wanted to share with you guys some thoughts that I had on the act of thinking and learning and stuff like that. If anybody doesn't know, tomorrow's my last day. So Curtis and Brian, I'll hold for applause. Curtis and Brian asked me last week, they said, hey, before you leave, can you give a couple of training sessions? And I was like, sure, yeah, what do you want me to train on? And Curtis said, well, how you learned what you've learned. Now, what Curtis didn't know is that the past year, I've actually been spending a lot of time thinking about myself and how I learn and how my brain works and things like that. So I immediately interpreted what he said as he wanted a lecture on epistemology. And probably not actually, in fact, when I talked to him on Monday, he's like, yeah, that's not actually what I was asking for. But the result of the interpretation I had went a little bit something like this.
I'm so sorry that I'm... But anyway, see, ladies, I was at this party and I lost track of the... I know. You know. So, here's the deal. Zeus, Mr. High and Mighty, Mr. Hades, get off of my cloud. Now he has a... We know! I know. I got it.
So there's a known phenomenon when you start to use a word too much or think too much about a word. Something happens in your brain and the word starts to lose all meaning. It just doesn't even sound like an English word anymore. And as I worked on this, that happened to me with the word know, to know things, which obviously made me think of the little Hercules quote. But I wanted to talk a little bit about ways we can categorize knowledge. And you guys have probably seen some form of this before, but my attempt here is to say, this is how I conceptualize the concept of the difference between things that we know and things we don't know. You can have things that you know you are unaware of. And a good example of that is dark matter. We know, because of the way calculations and cosmology work out, that there's a whole bunch of matter somewhere in the universe we can't detect. We have no idea where it is, but we have a good idea of how much of it there is and where it's not. So we would call that a known unknown. We have known knowns. These are the scientific facts. They're things that we know. Not only do we know, but we are aware of our knowledge and how we acquired the knowledge in such a way that we can teach and train and perpetuate that knowledge to further generations. You have the unknown unknowns. The example I like to use for this is sentience. We don't actually know what it means to be self-aware. We know what it's not, but we don't know what it is. The thing with unknown unknowns, the really kind of pernicious problem with that space, is you don't even know what questions you should be asking. You're so ignorant of the subject matter, you don't even know where to start looking for new information about it. And then there's the unknown knowns. An example I like to use for that is breathing. I don't consciously think about or never had to have someone teach me how to breathe. Somehow I know it. I don't know how I know it. It's just a thing that happens for me. And I tried to unpack in my own brain, in my own life, kind of how much of what I do or what I am breaks down into these buckets. So I kind of felt like about 10% of the things that affect me on a daily basis, I have no idea how they work. I don't know how an internal combustion engine works. Doesn't matter. I'm still able to get to work in the morning. I don't know how I learned how to breathe. I don't know how I got to that state, but it doesn't matter. I continue to breathe. This is about 25% of my life, is in these things where they happen and I don't know that they happen, or I don't even know that they happen, but they do, and it keeps me alive, it keeps my life as well. That leaves about 5% for scientific facts. These are the things that I'm aware that I understand. Which means almost 2/3 of my life, or more than 2/3, almost 3/4 of my life is spent on things that I don't even know I should be asking about. I don't even know what I should be learning. I don't even know how to get any better. A few years back, actually a lot of years back now that I think about it, one of my bosses made me read this book, The Goal, by Dr. Eli Goldratt. So Dr. Goldratt was a physicist teaching in university, and he got frustrated when he saw, there's all these businesses that fail. I don't know how much you guys know about business failure rates. I know the statistics for America, or at least a few years ago, the statistics were 95% of companies fail in the first 5 years. 95% of the remaining 5% fail within 10 years. So if you get to 11 years, you are one of the rare companies that actually survives and lasts that long. Dr. Goldratt said there's no reason this should be the case. There's actually no strong reason that companies should fail so often. What I can do as a scientist is I can bring the scientific method to business. So he became a business management consultant, and he started consulting with companies, showing them how to turn their businesses around. And after a few years of that, he said, you know what, this isn't working, it's taking too long. His thought was, if I turn around one company, everyone else in that industry will look at how that company's doing things and why they're succeeding, when their own company X is succeeding, my company's not. Let me copy what they're doing and learn the things that Dr. Goldratt wanted everybody to learn. It wasn't working that way. Companies would succeed. The other companies that are failing would say, they're just lucky, or they happen to hit the right idea at the right time, things like that. So he said, you know what, I'm going to try writing a book. And the interesting thing about the book, The Goal, it's written as a novel. It's a story. It's a story about a guy who is the manager of a manufacturing plant. And he's told by the global conglomerate that owns the manufacturing plant, you've got 3 months to turn this company around, or we're shutting the plant down and you're all fired. So he has to learn how to run the company more effectively. Lucky for him, he runs into his old college physics professor, who's basically Dr. Goldratt, Mary Sued into the book, who teaches him all the things that he needs to know about manufacturing plants and how to do his company more efficiently. This book was a huge success. It sold millions of copies. After a few years, Dr. Goldratt gets frustrated again because the only people who are taking that book and improving their businesses tend to be manufacturing plants. And he's saying, these aren't manufacturing specific ideas. So he wrote a few more books. One's called It's Not Luck, and one's called The Critical Chain. It's Not Luck talks about how to apply the same concepts to sales and marketing. Critical Chain talks about how to apply it to project management. Another group of people, after Goldratt passed away, he's since died, another group of people wrote a book called The Phoenix Project that talks about how to apply those concepts to IT and to some extent to software engineering. And I think they're really good books for starting to think about how we learn and how we do things. So he talks about 5 things you need to do in order to change, in order to improve, in order to get better. So the first thing you have to do is you have to clearly identify what your goal is. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Then you have to understand, what do I need to change about that thing to get where I want to be? This is the it. What needs to change? Then you have to say, in what way do I need to change it? You can't skip these 3 steps. You actually have to take the time to sit down and think about those 3 steps. A lot of people try to jump straight to step 4 and just start making lists of things they need to do to be better, but they haven't done the first 3 steps, so they end up spinning their wheels or they're spending energy on the wrong things. Once you've done those 3 things, you can say, okay, now what is the list of mechanical things that I can do in order to enact the change I want to do? And then the fifth step that he says, and a lot of people miss this one when they try to just make the list of how they want to be better, is to say, how do I now turn what I just did into a process of ongoing improvement for the rest of my life? Now, going back to this little chart, what I would say is I try to use the goal in my life to move things from this area up into this area. That's the ideal. Unfortunately, there's just not enough time, there's not enough space in a human life. So I also understand that in some cases, I may need to move them into one of these other 2 boxes. I'm never going to take the time to learn how an internal combustion engine works because there are so many other things I need in the top right box. It's just too low of a priority for me. So I'll leave it in the top left box there. So let's talk a little bit about the human brain. Used to be, for a long time, we thought the human brain worked in a particular way. We thought from childhood through adolescence till somewhere in your mid-20s, maybe your 30s, if you're really lucky, you're learning all the time. And then your brain kind of stops learning, it stops growing. And you might be able to learn new things, but your brain just does not grow as fast, it doesn't change as easily. And then somewhere, maybe in your 70s or your 80s, it starts to deteriorate, and you start to lose information you already have. Well, in the past 20 years or so, maybe, we've learned about this thing called neuroplasticity, which really says your brain is always changing. Every time you do something, whether you elect to say something or elect not to say it, every time you learn a new skill, every time you make a decision, your brain changes in order to accommodate that event. And your brain can primarily change in 3 different ways. It can change chemically, it can change structurally, and it can change functionally. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what those terms mean here. Chemical change is actually nearly impossible for you to cause by yourself. Chemical change is there's a flood of new chemicals activating a particular region of your brain, making it work a little bit harder than it's accustomed to working. This is short-term improvements. We can't really force these. We can prepare for them. We can put ourselves in a position to take advantage when it happens, but you can't really make it happen. It's very fast. It happens very quickly. It's where we're responsible for intuitive leaps, unless you're Steve Jobs, which means it's that acid trip you did back in the 1960s that's responsible for it. But because it's so fast and the chemicals fade, they lose efficacy really quickly, it can fade just as quickly. If you've ever had the experience of you're going home at the end of the day and you're thinking, okay, I know exactly what I need to get to do tomorrow, and you come in the next morning and you think, boy, I can't even remember. I had in my head exactly what I needed to do next. Now I have to relearn all that stuff. It's because what you experienced was a chemical change, and it faded when the chemicals faded. The really interesting thing is the way we can prepare our brains to take advantage of the chemical change when it happens. So there are two primary modalities of thinking, modes in which we can think. The first one is the focus mode. This is where you're paying attention to one thing, you're zeroed in on something. And the second is diffuse mode. This is where I'm not really actively thinking about anything. Maybe I'm daydreaming, maybe I'm reading something. I'm not primarily trying to force my brain into a specific shape. And what they've found with a lot of fMRIs and other studies is most creative thinking actually doesn't happen in either state. It happens somewhere in the transition from one state to the next. So the example they give is they say, imagine a pinball machine that is completely packed. Every spare inch of that pinball machine is packed with bumpers. And you fire off the pinball and it comes down in, and it starts in the top right corner, and where you need to be, your fresh original ideas in the bottom left corner. If that pinball machine is completely packed with bumpers, you're never going to get from where the pinball came out to where you want to be. It's too focused, there's too much going on. And yet, in the diffuse state, this is a pinball machine where there's like one or two bumpers, and your odds of even hitting anything are very, very low. It's somewhere in between those two is the actual happy accident of having original creative thought take place. The other example they give is the race car versus the hiker. They say, a race car, the guy gets where he's going really, really fast, but he doesn't have any appreciation for the journey that got him there. Whereas a hiker takes his time, walks around the park, looks at the trees, sees the butterfly flying, everything's great. But if he had to walk to get, if I had to walk from here to Grand Teton National Park in order to experience Grand Teton National Park, it'd take me a long time to get there. So neither one of those states is completely independently the one you want to be in. Focusing on the transition between the two is how we prepare ourselves. They also talked a little bit about illusions of competence in learning. I'm running a little bit late, so I'm not going to go into this quote, but basically what they say is when you are studying, you have no way of knowing if what you're studying is what's going to be on the test. And that's especially true for us as we go to work with customers. We're trying to learn technology, we're trying to be good at AEM or whatever it is that we do, but we don't know what the customer's question is going to be. We don't know what their concerns and what their needs are going to be. We have no way of knowing how to prepare for that. So what they say is to be aware of three specific things. The first thing to be aware of and cautious of is test anxiety. This is just the inability to allow yourself to learn, to allow that chemical change to happen in a state where you're ready, because you're so worried that you're not going to be prepared for it. Next thing to be worried about is the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is the tendency to have more confidence when I have less capability. So they did this study a long time ago. They said, look, when it comes to highly technical things, the less capable you are, the more inclined you are to confidence because you don't understand all those unknown unknowns. You don't even know how many of them there are. You think, hey, this is just a simple matter of programming. It's going to be fine. The flip side of the Dunning-Kruger effect is imposter syndrome, which is as I really start to understand my job and the space I'm working in, I start to become aware of all the things I don't know. And now all I can ever see, and this is something I suffer from a lot, I know some of the people in this company I've talked with also suffer from it. All I can see is the things I don't know. I'm completely aware of exactly where my ignorance is, and that scares the crap out of me and makes me convinced that I'm actually not any good at my job. This is a negative mental state. Don't let yourself fall into that trap. So the next kind of change that our brains can take is a structural change. This is where your brain actually changes shape to accommodate some skill that you've acquired or some tool or technique that you have. This is where our long-term improvements take place. But getting from short-term chemical change to long-term structural change requires practice. There's a great quote, and I'll repeat this quote at least once more. Nothing is more effective than practice. Increased difficulty during practice leads to both more learning and greater structural change. You guys ever heard of Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers? If you haven't heard of it, it was really popular in the New York Times bestsellers list a few years ago. And what happened was a lot of people read it, and then they would tell other people what it said, and it became this game of telephone, especially in America, where by the time you get down to people who have never even heard of the book, but someone described to them the symptoms that were described in the book, what it became in the conversation was, it takes 10,000 hours to get good at anything. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever done math, but 10,000 hours is 5 years of a full-time job. So now you have a bunch of people out there in the world thinking, if I wanted to learn to play the guitar, it's going to take 5 years full-time job. I'm never going to get there unless I'm a professional musician. Well, the truth is that's not what the book said. What the book said is if you want to be at the top of the field in very specific, very narrow, very technical fields, that's where that 10,000 hours comes from. If you want to be Peyton Manning in the NFL or Tom Brady in the NFL, yes, that will take 10,000 hours. That was a bone to Chris, I know. If you want to be Itzhak Perlman, yes, it's going to take 10,000 hours of violin playing to get there. So the real question is, how long does it take to get good at something? Because I don't need to be an expert, but I do need to get good at it. So how long does it actually take? And research tells us if you do it the right way, it's about 20 hours. To get good enough at something that you can actually do it and be satisfied with your performance. But you have to spend those 20 hours doing the right thing. The first thing you have to do is you have to learn how to deconstruct the skill. Because most skills that you want in life are not actually one specific thing. And I like to use this, I like to describe playing the guitar. It's not just one thing. You have to strum with one hand. You have to move your fingers out on the frets with the other hand. You have to know how to tune it. You have to have a sense of rhythm. There's a lot of different pieces in there. You have to break down that skill into the components and say, what are the parts of the skill that will get me the thing that I want? Back to the goal again. What is the goal, and what do I need to change to get there? Practice the most important things first. Once you've done that deconstruction, you know what you need to focus on and what you need to practice. The next thing to do is to learn just enough about the skill to self-correct or to self-edit. One of the risks that I see in myself, and I see it in a lot of other technologists, is the tendency to want to learn something really, really well before I try doing anything with it. To buy Donald Knuth's Art of Computer Programming and read the whole entire 4-volume mega works before I sit down and try writing code. That is a dangerous trap to fall into. It's more important to learn just enough about the skill to know when you're making a mistake and what you need to do to stop making that mistake, to change and to grow. And then just get into it. Once you know how to self-edit, start practicing. Then you have to remove barriers to practice. Obvious ones, distractions, maybe turn off Facebook, turn off television, Netflix, whatever. Get rid of excuses in your life. Things that are, you're saying, well, I could do that, but I don't really want to. The one that I think is probably not so obvious, or at least it wasn't to me without stopping to think about this consciously, is fear. The interesting thing is that as human beings, we are really reluctant to feel stupid. And our own subconscious mind, in order to protect us from feeling stupid, will throw up imaginary barriers. It will find all kinds of reasons to stop us from trying new things. Because it knows you're going to feel stupid if you try that and you fail. And feeling stupid hurts. I don't like it. So I'm going to stop you from doing that. Then you have to actually get in and spend that 20 hours of practice. Once you know what you need to learn, you know how to self-edit, and you've removed the barriers, sit down, give yourself that 20 hours of practice. Again, talking about that feeling of stupid, being prepared to just plow through it. You know, you have a stupid, awkward self. I know I do.
I just want to say one thing about this. It's really important. This is like super critical. The more willing you are to say you're stupid about something, the more willing other people will be around you, because everybody feels the same way. And that's all you can do is just break that ice and just tell people that you're stupid, and everybody else will feel comfortable being stupid too. And it's so much easier. Yeah, no, I'm serious. There's nothing wrong with being stupid because everyone's stupid. So,
or get yourself with people who tell everyone how stupid you are on a regular basis. It works great.
I just wanted to point out that it's really important to be okay with being stupid.
Yeah. Well, and the key to this, like this concept, is that the major impediment to most people's lives to making long-term change in their life isn't actually capability or intellect. It's an emotional willingness to get there, right? So that's it. If you want to introduce structural change, go through those steps. Deconstruct the skills, learn to self-correct, remove the barriers to practice, and then commit to spending at least 20 hours on the thing before you make any decisions about giving it up or deciding it's not for you. The last way we can change our brain is functional. This is really interesting. This is the part that I learned the most about in preparing to give this presentation. I didn't really understand how functional change works. And I still would say, this is when I read the papers on this stuff, this was the thing I had the hardest time understanding. So I'm going to give you my limited understanding of it. Totally recognize that I may be getting this wrong, but here's the part that felt true. The thing that rang true to me, which is as you practice the skill of learning, as you do proactively set out to learn new skills, your brain will change the way it behaves, and it will become easier to activate the skill learning part of the brain. As we use certain parts of our brain, they become easier to activate in the future. And the great example that they give of this in the literature is addiction. Addiction of any kind. We're not just talking drugs or alcohol, even video game addiction. Any kind of addiction is a symptom of functional change in the brain. That's what powers addiction. This is where you get your process of ongoing improvement. The value of process of ongoing improvement is to make it easier to do every single time further down the road. This is where your 10,000 hour rule does come in. If I want to be one of those top people, I'm going to have to spend lots and lots of time doing this thing. And then the last thing I like to call it is I say, if you want to teach something, you probably had better understand it to the level that it is making a functional change in your own brain. The interesting thing about ongoing improvement is it's a force multiplier. I don't know how much you guys know about force multipliers, but the really simple example is a lever and a fulcrum. I can probably push about 400 pounds of force on a good day. If I want to move something that's 1,200 pounds, I'm going to need something else. And I can take a fulcrum and a lever, and by putting the fulcrum in the right spot, pressing down here, I get way more force over there than what I'm applying down here. Ongoing improvement becomes a force multiplier in your own life. Again, as it becomes easier to do, the same amount of investment gives me a greater return on the other side. So the three types of change, chemical, I like to refer to the chemical change as today I learned. Right? You ever had that? Oh, today I learned something, but then tomorrow I've probably forgotten it because I didn't ever implement structural change. I didn't turn it into long-term acquisition. And functional change, future improvements, easier to achieve. Those are the three things we're looking for here. So the thing I want to encourage all of you guys to do is to learn how your brain learns. Like I said, it took me a lot of thinking and unpacking of my own behavior and research to understand how this works. And there's a really interesting quote I found in one of the papers that I read trying to prepare for this, which said, there's so much variability from brain to brain. We have found it impossible in practice to draw general conclusions about what techniques will be effective. That means nobody can tell you how your brain is going to work. Even when we do very large studies with thousands of people in them, and we try to draw statistical analysis, the anomalies are so great, we can't make reasonable assumptions about brains. You're going to have to learn how you learn. My recommendation there is to determine how you're going to measure success. How am I going to decide if it's working for me or not? Fantastic quote. When performance is measured, performance improves. When performance is measured and reported, the rate of improvement accelerates. You guys all have a career advocate at Merkle. A person who can be the person that you're going to go to them and you're going to say, here is the change I want to make, the goal I'm going to set. Here's how I plan to measure it, and I'm going to report to you on a regular basis how it's working for me. If you want to improve the rate of improvement in your own life, leverage your career advocate to do that. You have to identify and break unsuccessful patterns and behaviors. I really like this quote from one of the papers that said, understanding how they develop routines that may be harmful and how to break those routines and embrace new ones may be the single most important task any human being can perform for themselves. Learning how you fall into bad and negative patterns, learning how to identify that before it happens and get yourself out of that rut and into a good pattern is the single most important change you could probably make to make your own life better on an ongoing basis. Back to that quote I shared before, if we're going to practice, we need to make sure we are regularly increasing the difficulty. Nothing is more effective than practice, and increased difficulty during practice leads to both more learning and greater structural and functional changes in the brain. So go out and build the brain you want. Use these steps, learning how your brain learns, determining how you're going to measure your progress on that, breaking the unsuccessful patterns and habits, and then practicing those right habits and increasing the difficulty on some kind of structured basis. I wanted to give some concrete tools. So I spent some time earlier this year. I got a call on Saturday afternoon from Shannon, salesperson upstairs, saying, hey, can you fly out to Connecticut on Monday morning to this company, Boehringer Ingelheim, BI? I said, sure, why am I going out there? And she said, we don't know. Nobody knows, just get on the plane. Okay, so we bought the plane ticket, I flew out there, and I met with the Merkle team. Merkle and BI are already in a relationship. Somehow, someone at Merkle decided we want Joey there for this meeting with the customer. So I asked the people at Merkle, why am I here? We don't know. Why, you tell us why you're here. I don't know. I don't even know what we're meeting about. I have no idea what's going on here. So we walk into a meeting with the customer Tuesday morning, and I say, all right, guys, how can I help? We don't know who you are. We didn't ask for you to come. Why are you here? Okay, start over. Why don't you guys tell me what problems you're having, technology-wise? What technology problems do you have in your company today? And I listened to 4 hours of griping, just whining and complaining. Every once in a while, I took a note, and I said, okay, you know what, guys? It's like 12:30, 12:45. Let's get lunch. Let's break for lunch. We went off site, had lunch at a restaurant, got to know a few of them on a personal level a little bit. We came back to the meeting room, and I said, okay, the next hour is mine, and I need you guys to listen to me now, and don't be focused on your gripes and your complaints. I'm going to tell you what you're doing wrong. And I identified 7 things that they did wrong, that they were doing wrong. And I said, you know, these first 3 things that you guys are doing wrong, I can't do anything about that. You guys have to decide you want to be different. You have to change your behaviors and your patterns. I told them specifically what they needed to do, but I can't make them do it. This has to be something BI decides as a company that we are going to change the way we're doing it. The next 3 things on the list, I said, Access 41, through the Merkle relationship, can help you with these. And I broke down potential contracts and how the work would line up. Here's the amount of engineering we can bring to the table to actually offer and solve you guys' problems. And then the 7th thing was, this is a service that my team at Access 41 provides. Because at that part, we were talking about server-specific issues. I said, you know what? Why don't you just hire us to be your managed services vendor? And you will never have to deal with these problems again. That's my team's problem now. Now, it turned out we didn't get the deal. We didn't get the BI decided not to sign those. Actually, I think what happened was BI kept dragging their feet. Merkle decided this is taking too long. It's never going to turn into business for us, and they stopped asking. But on the plane ride home the next day, or that night, I think it was Tuesday night when I came home, thought to myself, what the hell just happened? I had no idea why I was out there. How did I even do that? And so I started to try to parse out what I do to solve a problem. And this is the process that I came up with. It may not be perfect, but it's at least a place to start in systematically trying to solve problems. So the first thing is to ask yourself, can I describe the problem in more or less one breath? Now, more or less one breath, that's just an arbitrary limit that I set. The point of setting an arbitrary limit on it is to say, Do I know what should be filtered out and what is actually part of the problem? If I don't know that, I can't start to solve the problem yet because I haven't filtered down the things that actually matter out of the situation. So if you can't do that, do some research until you feel like you can split the problem in half. And once you split it in half, take the part that you personally are most uncomfortable with. You're the angriest about it. You're the most upset that it exists. It concerns you the most. You just take your gut feel for what's the biggest part of the problem and tackle it first and go back to the first step. Well, now I explain that half in more or less one breath. Continue that process until you can answer the first question yes. Now you have to say, and this is especially important when you're working with anyone other than yourself, restate the problem back to the person who described it to you to see if you understand the problem correctly. Now sometimes they may say, that's not what I said at all. You completely misunderstood me. It's fine. You need to find a different way to try the communication. The one I like to use, when I used at the time, was I said, can you guys show me? I'm clearly not getting it. Can you guys show me what you're doing? Where is the problem? But as I thought about this on the plane trip, I said, well, that's just one way of changing the mode of conversation, to try and exchange information in a different way. Some others might be, hey, can we draw it? Let's get on the whiteboard and do boxes and arrows and figure out where the issue is. Or you might be able to say, I'm going to restate again, you stop me the minute I say something wrong, and let's talk about that point. But the point is to change the way we're exchanging information so I can get closer to that understanding. You may occasionally have to return all the way back to step one in order to move forward. So once you actually have been able to state the problem correctly, you ask yourself, is this a problem I'm already familiar with? If it's not, that's okay. There's so much information in the world today. You can go research. I'm sure someone else has had this problem before. You can Google, you can read books, you can ask colleagues. You can attach a debugger to a process. One that I like to use in the systems engineering team is I like to try to automate the task. If I can't automate the task, it shows me at least where I don't understand the task well enough. You have to understand the task really well to effectively automate it. So if you're familiar with the problem, you just solve it. And if you can't solve it, something's wrong, go back to step one. So I'm going to give you guys a concrete example. The past week or so, I've been just kind of making myself available to anyone in the company who wanted to ask me questions, who had an issue. And somebody came in the other day and said, Joey, got a problem. I feel like my team is stuck. This is one of our lead developers. He's like, you know what? Everything in our work stream, it's too big, it's too vague. We have no way to move forward. We can't get any work done. So I listened to him for a while, and then I said, I think I understand. You're saying you don't feel like the definition of tickets in Jira is granular enough for you to do work on it. Is that right? He said, yeah, they're so big, the tickets are so large, we can't even think about them effectively, let alone figure out how to give them point values and actually start working on them. I said, well, this is a problem we're familiar with. We know how to solve this. Access 41 has a whole bunch of tools and techniques that we use to solve this. Sprint backlog, or backlog grooming and sprint planning being two big ones, right? You're obviously not getting enough done in your backlog grooming and your sprint planning in order to head effectively into your sprint. So work with your BA and your PM to improve that process. He says, well, problem is the BA and the PM won't support my efforts in having the backlog grooming and the sprint planning sessions. I'm getting resistance from them. I said, oh, well, what you're telling me is that we actually did step one wrong. We did not actually identify the problem correctly. That's okay. We return back to step one. You're saying the BA and PM aren't willing to hold backlog grooming sessions. What's going on there? Yeah, we haven't done any of those things in months. Okay, so just hold a meeting. Like, you and I finished this conversation, go hold a meeting. Well, the BA and PM said we're too far along in the project to actually do those meetings. Okay, all right, are you convinced, guy in the office with me here, are you really convinced that that's the problem and that this is the way forward? Yeah, I am. So I said, okay, so have you talked to the BA and the PM and told them the impact not having those things done in the right way is having on your team? Well, I haven't exactly done that. It's okay, so you need to do that. But before you go do that, let's you and I go through a couple scenarios of how that conversation might go so that you go out confident in that conversation that you can do the things you need to do. He said, well, maybe I know one of the people, they're too busy. They don't have the time to schedule it or even attend it. I said, okay, that's fine. If the problem is time, if that really is the concern, then go to that person and say, you know what, we're going to have the meeting. You don't need to come. You don't need to schedule it. I will record the audio. Somebody in the meeting will take really good written notes. And if need be, I will even load tickets into Jira for you and assign them to you so you can review them and make sure I'm doing it right. Let me take some of that work off your plate. If you are literally stuck, you can't do anything because you're waiting on someone else, then go to that someone else and say, can I take something off of your plate? Can I do something to unstick that constraint? Well, what if they don't actually believe in backlog grooming and sprint planning? You know what? Maybe that's possible. I don't know. I haven't had a conversation with every BA and PM, even every developer. I think there are probably developers who don't necessarily believe in those things. Do you believe in them? Yeah, I totally do. I think that those would help. Okay, great. Then don't wait for someone else to give you permission to be successful. If you think it's important and the other people don't, then you have it for yourself. Have your own team, do your own thing. You still have to do what the BA and the PM need you to do to get the job done, but if you need to do it in a different way to get your work done, take responsibility for that and go do it. So that was my attempt to apply that same problem-solving technique. I talked earlier about the theory of constraints. This is the goal by Dr. Goldratt. Another conversation I had this week was this question that somebody asked me. He said, hey, I want to ask you just some career advice. Should I be a generalist or a specialist? Should I just learn Java? Or should I learn AEM really, really well? And I said, well, you know, not consciously, but if I'm looking at myself 20 years ago and asking how did I answer this question for myself, I would go through the goal, right? I would say, what's the goal? Well, for me, for Joey Smith, the goal was to be employable. I want to be able to have a job no matter what technology is hot. No matter if AEM drops off the face of the earth, if Adobe stops selling it, I know I'm going to trip on it. I got to stop the time to shoot before I trip on it, because I can't not pace back and forth. No matter if Adobe stopped selling AEM, nobody wanted it anymore, I still want to be able to have a job. So what I decided to do, I said, what do I need to change about myself? What I decided to do is I said, you know what, I'm not going to bet on any particular programming language. And a concrete example I can give you guys of that is I am 99% sure I'm the worst Java programmer in this room. And not by a little bit, by a very large margin.
No,
I could not. I don't think so. I think Pete could write a better Java program than I could.
It's true.
I could not sit down and write a Java program from scratch if I had to. I could Google it and copy and paste stuff, but I don't actually know Java. Right? But I work with AEM all the time, which is in Java. And I wander around with developers up here and they ask me questions and I look at Java code and I'm able to help them understand where their problem is. How did I get there? Well, the answer to the question that I gave to myself was, and it's going to sound a little bit fake, but stick with me to this. The answer I gave was, I'm going to be a specialist in generalized terms and a generalist in specialized things. So what I did to parse out what I mean by that, I decided many years ago that what I was going to do was become a specialist in programming languages in general. I don't know any given programming language very well. But what I do know, I learned like 30 different programming languages, and I solved one particular problem using a bunch of different programming languages. I knew them just well enough to understand how programming languages work and be able to pick apart, no matter what the programming language is, how to start solving a problem. So I asked myself what the goal was. It was to be employable. What do I need to change? I need to figure out where I need to be a specialist, where I need to be a generalist. What do I need to change about it? Well, I decided to be a specialist in programming languages, but when it comes to things like AEM or WordPress, I only have a vague notion of how they work most of the time. But I know just enough to go find somebody who's a specialist in it and ask them, hey, how does the resource resolver work? How does multi-site manager work? I don't know. I don't use it. I don't deal with the thing. Help me understand and just enough of it to solve my problem, and I'm okay with that being just a chemical change. I'm not going to try and turn that into structural change most of the time. I'd rather specialize in the overall broad concepts. And then how do I turn that into a process of ongoing improvement? I try to learn a new programming language every couple of years. When a new programming language comes out and it starts to get some media attention, some heat in the development community, I try to learn just enough of it that if someone were to ask me a question, I could sit down with them and I could at least syntactically and structurally understand the question. Probably couldn't write programs in it, but I could at least have a conversation with them about it. Okay, that's the main goal, the main bulk of the talk. There's some resources I wanted to offer you guys, things that I found very helpful in my own career. The book, The Pragmatic Programmer, From Journey to Master, it's a very cool book. The term pragmatic is not chosen accidentally there. They give you specific things you can do to be a better developer and tell you exactly how to go about doing them and why they are valuable to you. Again, the book, The Goal by Dr. Goldratt, it's probably been, for me, one of the most valuable books that I've ever read in my life. 7 Languages in 7 Weeks was a good one for me. Again, going back to that idea of being a specialist in the general concept of programming languages. It walks you through in 7 completely different programming languages. He tried to pick languages that weren't similar to each other. So you have Python in there, but you have a C-based language. I think it was Perl? I can't remember now. You learn some Ruby, you learn some, I can't remember now what all the languages were, but he tries to say, we're going to solve the same problem in a bunch of different languages so we can see how they kind of converge and what are the commonalities between them. I think understanding the Unix shell, especially as long as we continue to be on Macs, is going to be a valuable lifelong skill. You can automate your own job away if you understand the Unix shell really well. Pieces of it, not the entire thing, but big pieces of it. Mastering regular expressions changed my appreciation of and understanding of text. It helped me realize that as programmers, at a very basic level, 99% of our job is working with text. Taking it from one place and putting it to the other place in a structured way so that all the information is kept and it's useful and we're able to recall it and reuse it. We're really processing text all the time. Understanding how text works at the byte level, at the character level, mastering regular expressions not only gives you the tools to manipulate text in very effective and productive ways, but it will help you understand text in a more fundamental concept. JavaScript, The Good Parts, is a really, really good book. If you guys haven't seen this book, there's a book by O'Reilly & Associates. It's JavaScript, The Definitive Guide. It's like 1,800 pages. It's about that thick. And then they published years later with Douglas Crockford a book called JavaScript, The Good Parts, which is about that thick. It's like 120 pages or something like that, which tells us 90% of the Java programming language is not part of the good parts. Right? There's so much in that language. But if you can learn to use most effectively the parts that are called out in JavaScript, the good parts, you will be a better engineer overall because not all you do front-end programming, but learning JavaScript that way will change the way you think about programming languages in general and the way you start to solve and approach problems. I know you guys don't use SQL a lot, but I do think that over the long term, I don't think SQL is going away. Sorry, I don't think it is. I know NoSQL is super hot. Everybody loves it. I think SQL is coming back. I don't think it's going anywhere. Too much of the world is powered by relational databases. This is a really good book from C.J. Date. C.J. Date was the graduate student to E.F. Codd when he created the concept of SQL and relational databases. So this is a guy who knows relational databases probably better than anyone in the world, where they are and where they should be. He then goes and teaches a really effective, it's an O'Reilly Associates book. It's really, really good about learning SQL and understanding relational databases, how they work. I think it's a good skill to have in your quiver. The Personal MBA, I forgot to put the author on there for this one. It's Josh Kaufman. So he used to be a professor of an executive MBA program. I think it was Harvard, but sometimes I think it was Yale, some Ivy League school. And he like looked at his own life and he said, it's kind of bull crap what we do. Harvard, or whoever it was, said we charge people like $50,000 and up for these executive MBA programs. And what we do is we give them a list of books to read, and we have some exercises, we have some conversations with them, group projects and stuff like that, and then we give them a piece of vellum that says, hey, you went through Harvard's executive MBA program. Most of them probably aren't learning a lot. And instead, what I could do is I could go out there and say, hey, whole world, here's the same list of books. There's no reason you should have to pay Harvard $50,000 to get that list of books. He also built with it a website that lets you go through the exercises and the conversations and that stuff. I have not done that. I've only read his book and then taken from his book and his explanations of what's in there, the books that I thought were valuable, and read those for myself and learned those skills for myself. Just some quick suggestions on especially for the engineers. If you want to be a better AEM programmer, I would recommend you go try to take Sling, Jackrabbit, and Felix and try to rebuild AEM. Build enough of AEM that you can run a blog. Do this in your own personal time. You will learn so much more about AEM and how the pieces work, sometimes don't work together, doing that than you ever will solving customer level problems. Read every article on AEMpodcast.com. Pete and I agonize over every article that goes up there. We have conversations with people. Is this actually valuable? Is this important? Is this useful? We spend a lot of time trying to make sure the content that goes up there will be useful to you guys. At least take the time to read the titles. And if you don't feel like you natively understand that title, read the article, read the body of it. Some really, really good content that we've gotten up there over the years. Not all of it by Access 41 employees either. We've had external authors write stuff. Read about all of the ACS AEM Commons features. I get that you're probably never going to use them all, but you should know what's in it. Because I see people here all the time reinventing ACS AEM Commons features. And there's just no reason that should happen. At least familiarize yourself what's in there, because that should be in every single one of our projects at this point. I don't think there's any excuse for not having that included in our projects and using the features that are there.
It can break builds.
What's that?
It can break builds. I've seen it break builds
Okay,
before.
we should file a bug on that. Build and contribute something to an open source project. This is going back to that concept of practice and practice harder. Get out there in the world, working with other people and people that you don't know face to face. Try to contribute something to an open source project. That will help you learn that problem solving and the soft skills will come as a result of that. I'm always begging for AEM podcast content. Every time I get to talk to you guys, I try to ask, please somebody write blog posts. We need more content. We want the content that's useful, which means you guys are better judges of what goes on there probably than we are. Tell us what the articles need to be and help us get the articles written. I do believe learning a new programming paradigm is a very important thing. So this goes back to the JavaScript, the good parts thing. Changing the way you think about programming languages will change the way you write Java. If you're really learning the paradigm, I don't care what language you're learning, go out and learn some different paradigms. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever looked at Prolog or ML. These are logic-based languages. They approach problem solving in a completely different way. A lot of our declarative programming stuff came out of the movement of Prolog. And if you start to think about how can I write at a higher level, how can I declare what I want done instead of having to write all the procedural code to get what I want done, you'll be more effective and you'll be more efficient in the time that you do spend. And the last thing I wanted to call is just do evaluate your goals with your career advocate. You guys have a person whose job it is, or at least part of their job, is to make sure that you are becoming the best person that you can be. Not just for Merkle's sake and not just for Access 41's sake, but because you are an important person and you should have an opportunity to invest in yourself. I thank all you guys for your time and good luck in your future endeavors.
Good job.
Can't remember how we figured out how to stop this. Oh, it's down here.